Again, I'm Rob Saldine, Director of the Project on American Democracy and Citizenship. Welcome to our next panel called Wilderness in American Art, Literature, and Culture. I'm going to introduce Jim McCusick, who will then kick things off. Jim McCusick is Professor of English and Dean of the Davidson Honors College here at the University of Montana. Over the last 2 decades, his scholarly work has pioneered the development of a new kind of literary criticism known as eco-criticism. This is an interdisciplinary approach to the study of British and American literature that seeks to uncover the intellectual roots of the modern environmental movement in the nature writings of earlier periods. His book, Green Writing, Romanticism and Ecology, was published in 2000. It's been translated into Japanese and recently republished in a 2nd edition. His research and teaching interests include British Romanticism, literary theory, environmental studies, and the history of science. And I think there's nobody better to chair this panel. Please welcome Jim.
Well, thank you, Rob. We've been celebrating the imperative of wilderness at 50 years, but the idea of the wholeness of nature goes much deeper, probably millennia deeper than that, perhaps as long as we've existed as a species on this planet. Luckily, we won't have to go back that far today, but I do think this session is particularly of interest to anyone who loves wilderness, because we are going to explore the last 2 centuries of thought about wilderness. And here to kick off that exploration are 2 of my very favorite colleagues who've been delving into the study of wilderness for a good part of their respective careers. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to each of them and then ask them to speak. Each of them has a very cool PowerPoint, which you'll enjoy. And then we'll please hold questions until they've both had a chance to do their presentations. So first, join me in welcoming Samantha Harvey, Associate Professor of English at Boise State University. Samantha joined the faculty of the BSU Department of English in 2010. She received her PhD from Cambridge University in English Lit and her BA in English and the Study of Religion from Harvard University. Dr. Harvey's teaching and research interests include 19th century British poetry and prose, transatlantic romanticism, and literature and the environment. Samantha is the author of an amazing and wonderful book entitled Transatlantic Transcendentalism, Coleridge, Emerson, and Nature, published just last year. This book explores the ways in which Samuel Taylor Coleridge's thought galvanized Emerson at a pivotal moment in his intellectual development, giving Emerson new ways to harmonize the romantic triad of nature, spirit, and humanity. This book reveals Coleridge's centrality for Boston Transcendentalism and Vermont Transcendentalism, a movement which profoundly affected the subsequent development of modern higher education, the national press, and the emergence of pragmatism. Is that a big book or what? Debbie Lee is Professor of English at Washington State University. She received her PhD from the University of Arizona in Tucson in 1998 and began teaching at WSU the same year. She has specialties in 2 different fields. First, Western wilderness literature and history, and second, late 18th century and early 19th century British literature and history. Debbie is currently working on a book, a manuscript, and photograph archive, as well as an oral history collection funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities and entitled the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness History Project. And if I can lay out our agenda for this session, I would say Samantha is going to be talking to you mainly about 19th century literature, history, and culture, and Debbie Lee is going to bring it up right to Montana in the 20th century. So let's begin by welcoming Samantha.
Thank you so much, Jim, for that kind introduction. And I also want to thank Dane Scott, Rob Saldin, Zach Port, and Mickey Hellman, and everyone associated with the Mansfield Conference. It's just a fantastic opportunity to dialogue on this really important anniversary, and it's been a very enjoyable experience so far. So I'm just going to get my PowerPoint going here. So at least there'll be pretty pictures to look at if all else fails. Sorry, from beginning. Great. Excellent. So As we face unprecedented changes to our natural environment, I often ask what I can do to make a difference, more broadly as a humanist and more specifically as an English professor. And I think that one way is to use intellectual history to better understand how ideas of nature have changed over time and how different generations have responded to these changes. Another way is to examine the way in which cultural values are embedded in language, not only to reevaluate old language, but also to forge new language that re-envisions the interrelationships between nature and humanity in more positive and productive ways. In my talk today, I will do three things. Firstly, to look at a particular time in intellectual history, transatlantic romanticism, as a pivotal moment for the birth of modern environmentalism. Secondly, I'd like to focus on one specific example from that period, Thomas Cole, the founder of the Hudson River School of Landscape Painting, as an example of how the humanities were instrumental in establishing foundational and enduring ideas of wilderness that are still part of American culture today. Thirdly, I'd like to see how Thomas Cole might cast new light on complex contemporary problems, including redefinitions and reevaluations of terms like wilderness. And I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about transatlantic romanticism as a field. Sorry here. So transatlantic romanticism is defined as the period 1776 to 1860. And the reason for those dates is that it's looking at the period not just as a national movement happening in either Europe or England or in America, but looking at what happens as ideas cross the Atlantic. And I think this, I put the picture of the map here to think about the Atlantic Ocean as a dynamic context, not as a dead negative space. I think often when we look at maps, we think of the blue oceans as sort of negative space that are empty. We focus on the continents. But if you imagine what was crossing the ocean in this period, 1776 to 1860, it was a very dynamic place indeed. People, books, commodities, pamphlets, in the early part of it, the slave trade, all of these things are happening across the Atlantic Ocean. And so if we restore this debate, we'll see how ideas of nature cross the Atlantic and change as they cross the Atlantic. And I think now more than ever, we need to understand how ideas of nature change. As the scholar Scott Slovic stated, there's a pressing need for the, quote, vigorous historical and cultural contextualization of our environmental ideas. So why is this important? Well, even modern environmentalists, even those who are really well read in literature, will often look to Emerson or Thoreau as the founders of modern environmentalism. But in reality, they're deeply informed by what was happening across the Atlantic in Europe and England, including very radically changing ideas of nature, not only the physical environment, but also ideas of human nature and the nature of society. These changes were not only dramatic, but they happened in a relatively short period of time. So when we were looking at this map and thinking about, I like all the crisscrosses that make us focus on all the points of contact between countries. If we look at romanticism through a global rather than a national lens, we can see how changes in Europe directly affected the development of American literature and culture, including the idea of wilderness. So as an example of what is going on, let's go the right direction. There are three very major revolutions happening on the other side of the Atlantic. Political revolutions, like the French Revolution, of course, American Revolution on the other side. These were moments in which political revolutions were questioning the fundamental nature of society itself. In the terms of social revolutions, the women's movement and abolition were redefining human rights and what it meant to be a human being. And there was a lot of debate about the role of human nature as those changes were unfolding. And the Industrial Revolution, of course, is one of the most seismic shifts in our modern time. It was a complete shift from agrarian to industrial and also a globalized society. So these are things that are happening over the Atlantic and, of course, influence things that are happening in America very directly. And I think if we match these topics with issues today, we're in a similarly dramatic moment, perhaps even as revolutionary as the Romantic period. If we think about technology, advances in medicine, globalization, the possibility of engineering the environment, I could go on and on, any or all of these potentially could transform how we think about nature and what is natural. For the Romantic period, the arts and letters and artists and writers and intellectuals felt that they could change the world. And they did change the world. Romantics on both sides of the Atlantic were able to effect what Jim McCusick called, quote, a revolution in consciousness, unquote, in which people radically redefined their ideas of nature in radical, far-reaching, and transformative ways. And by the way, this is why I like the word nature, and I defend the use of the word nature as opposed to just the environment, precisely because it encompasses the physical environment, human nature, and the nature of society in an interconnected way. And I think that's what we need to restore in today's conversations, which are often trapped in disciplinary silos when it comes to the environment. And I feel also that once debates reach the level of public policy, they're often polarized, and there isn't always opportunity to discuss conflicting ideas of nature that are at the root of those conflicts. So to shift now to the second part of my talk, I'd like to look at this particular moment in transatlantic romanticism, which is the Hudson River School of Landscape Painting. Thomas Cole, who was a foundational figure in this movement, is often heralded as a founding pioneer of American art. And the reason for that is the Hudson River School is the first distinctive school of American art in the sense that it wasn't just imitating European art, it was something new and different. However, he was born in England. He emigrated in 1801 as an adult. He was steeped in British Romantic texts, aesthetics. He traveled extensively in Europe. So in other words, he was truly a transatlantic figure. He was at the crossroads of two eras, two countries, and two contexts. And his view of nature is considerably richer and more complex precisely because of his transatlantic hybridity. Because the Hudson River School was considered this first distinctive American school, there's been an attempt, not only by Cole's contemporaries, but also by later scholars, to call him a quote-unquote fully native figure, like to claim him only for America. But in many ways, this obscures not only his debt to British and European sources, but also the complexity of his view of nature, that in many ways is more conflicted and complicated than later artists of the school, such as Asher Durand, Frederick Edwin Church, Albert Bierstadt, and Thomas Moran. Many people have commented that these later painters could be seen as implicitly celebrating American exceptionalism and the doctrine of manifest destiny. And for a long time, this crossover between the aesthetic and the political plagued the Hudson River School. And I'd like to just reevaluate that as we contemplate the Wilderness Act and also Thomas Cole. So I'm going to show you a few more slides here, also because they're just so beautiful to look at. This is a later painter of the school, Sanford Gifford, and what I really enjoy is this, I don't know if there's a laser on here. No. Oh yeah, there is, great. I like this little rock here. I call this the Lion King rock. You know, it's this sort of rocky outcrop that invites you to sort of survey the landscape. And one scholar calls this the magisterial gaze. We're sort of floating midway between heaven and earth, and we have a sort of godlike perspective on this gorgeous landscape. So what I like to point out is that many of these paintings, at first glance, they look like just simple landscapes, and we're very familiar with this kind of aesthetic because of the success of the school. But there are usually ideas of nature embedded in these paintings. And I think there's another great example here with Frederick Church's Niagara Falls, which demonstrates the sublime scale of American landscape that really set it apart from European landscape. And this is really America's first ecotourism spot. You know, this is a spot where people came precisely because it was different than anything else in Europe, and they wanted to bear homage to this distinctively American landscape. Another famous painting of the school, Albert Bierstadt's Scene in the Rocky Mountains, suggests another idea of nature, which is there were certain liberties taken with the truthfulness of these scenes. You know, this really wasn't a very accurate depiction of native peoples who were not necessarily in this subalpine meadow in teepees, but it didn't matter for the audience of these paintings who wanted to see a kind of new Western exotic landscape to them. But that also creates problems in the kind of ideas of nature that advance forward later in the school. And this final painting here is not in America at all. It's in South America. And this is what happens with the Hudson River School. It starts in the Hudson River Valley. They move west looking for further undefiled landscapes, and then they even go to South America. So I'm showing you these paintings, first of all, to just enjoy the beauty of these wonderful works, but also to think of the enshrined cultural attitudes that are associated with many of these paintings. for good and for ill. And one of these enshrined ideas, and I'm linking it here with a poem by William Cullen Bryant, was the idea that the groves were God's first temples. Okay? So here's an attempt to see in the American wilderness something that was gone in Europe, which was basically virgin forest. And of course, America didn't have cathedrals, it didn't have ruins, but it had the California redwoods. So if we read through this poem here, we'll see that there were certain religious ideas about America being a place where you could get a second chance to, or to go back even in time to a purer idea about religion and nature. Now, whether that's true or not, we'll discuss. But these landscapes were infused with ideas, and these ideas become instrumental in many ways for the Wilderness Act. We could say that this is the first step towards the Wilderness Act in many ways. And another thing I'd like to point out with some further paintings here, I'm going to ask you what they have in common. First of all, I can tell you what you won't know from the slides. They're all very large. These are large paintings. And that would have been quite a bold move, because these paintings were on a scale that was usually reserved for history painting or altarpieces. So these were considered very elevated genres. So to take a landscape and take it out of the realm of the dining room picture, or the fireplace picture, and make it as big as an altarpiece suggested some of the tactics by these painters to make this into a kind of spiritual type of artwork. Here's another work by Moran, Grand Canyon at Yellowstone. And this is just about the size it would be in the museum, right? So it gives you a sense of the scope. And if you look here, you can see how the figures are just absolutely tiny, right, to foreground the immensity of these landscapes. This one of Yosemite Valley with a very characteristic golden light kind of, coming through the beautiful walls of rock. That's another thing that these have in common, and especially this last one as well. All of these paintings are glorifying alpine scenes. And this might seem very commonplace today, but going back even to the 17th century, mountains were seen as ugly. They were seen as ruins, as wastes, as desolate, as a place where you could get killed by bandits. They were described as warts, wens, or blemishes. So this changed, and it changed because of the Romantic painters and poets who said, no, because of the sublimity and the grandeur and the awe that we feel in these landscapes, these are beautiful, or they're sublime, if not beautiful. So these shifts are all happening in this period of time. There's another thing that these have in common. Did anyone guess it yet? What do they all have in common? Sierra, Yosemite, any guesses? National parks, right? All of these places are national parks. And they became national parks in part because of these painters. Because these painters showed that there was a different kind of value that you could associate with a landscape other than what commodities you could pull out of them. So these are the positive things. These lead to really positive preservation movements. However, there's also a darker side. And this is not a Hudson River School painting, but it uses some of the language of the Hudson River School. And it's called American Progress, and it has this allegorical figure here of progress floating in the magisterial sense across the landscape, and pushing away native peoples, the buffalo, and even the alpine landscape is sort of seen as an obstacle to be overcome by American progress. So many of the later Hudson River School painters in particular are seen as connected to the doctrine of manifest destiny, in which unbridled expansion, first into the American West and then later outside of American borders, was seen as an unquestioned right. And so things take a different direction here, and it's a direction that we need to attend to. Church made one of the most popular pictures of the period, which was called The Heart of the Andes. It was so popular, it was sent around the country by railroad car. It was exhibited in various American cities. Only this one painting, you would go and you'd pay your money to see this one painting. And I think it's very interesting and telling that there are these portraits of American presidents, all of whom had to do with American territory expansion. So when you were looking at these paintings in this time period, they were literally framed, not just figuratively, but literally framed in the context of American political thought and American cultural identity as well. So all of these paintings have ideas of nature in them. And I want to return for a minute to Thomas Cole, because he's the first one. He's the founder of the school. And I really feel that his perspectives on wilderness are quite different than some of these later painters, who are really, as I said, much more cheerful about American expansion. One of his most famous paintings we're seeing here is called The Oxbow, and it shows two very different aspects of American landscape. On one hand, we have the wilderness here, looking pretty untouched, and then we've got this settled land to the right. And this was an actual scene that you could go and hike up to in this period in 1836. So, on one hand, we can just enjoy this as a landscape, but I think we are also invited to read it allegorically. And if we do so, we'll see that this river also looks like a question mark. And I think the question is, where is America's future? Where are we going? And there's also another element here, which is, it's hard to see right there, but these are Hebrew letters that are formed by clear cuts in the forest. And the Hebrew letters spell out Shaddai, which means the Almighty. So Cole here is suggesting that we read the book of nature for spiritual language here. And I think that he's also asking what we're going to do about the situation. Clearly, if we cut down all the forest, the Almighty is gone, right? And I think that's a very potent criticism and something that we need to attend to as we judge the school and its ideas of nature. This is a famous essay that Thomas Cole wrote called The Essay on American Scenery, and there's also very conflicted statements about wilderness and wildness. You can see how often he refers to wildness. I highlighted some of those pieces. He says the most distinctive and perhaps the most impressive characteristic of American scenery is its wildness. So he's claiming it as an American distinctive quality. But he also says lower on here, the cultivated must not be forgotten. Okay, so he's not trying to prioritize wilderness above all. He's looking for a balanced vision. And I think that this makes him, in some ways, a forerunner of where we are now, trying to balance different needs for the landscape. Cole also revisited this very same issue in a very famous painting cycle called The Course of Empire. And it's a really kind of extraordinary painting cycle. It shows the states of civilization, starting from the savage state, which has teepees here. There's like a version of temples here, and then it builds with the same landscape. We set the same mountain here. But by the consummation of empire, the natural world is almost completely obliterated, except for that one mountain peak right here. So that might look very optimistic, like, oh, see how progress is making civilization great. But if you look carefully at the consummation of empire, there are already seeds of its destruction. You can see there's signs of decadence and greed that soon will lead to destruction and desolation. So Thomas Cole suggests here that wilderness always exists in opposition to another state. You could call it cultivation, you could call it civilization, or you could call it what Barbara Novak refers to as nature and culture. But this is an uneasy balance, a difficult balance that's always threatening to spin apart. And I think that Cole is quite different from the later school, precisely because he's looking at what happens at the borders of wilderness, at the edges of wilderness. It's not just about seeking the last untouched wilderness. It's about understanding that it comes at the cost of other things and other ideas of nature. And I think that for this reason, he has a great deal to teach us, particularly as we reevaluate the 50-year legacy of the Wilderness Act. We have to attend to some of the same questions that he did. What happens at the borders of wilderness and non-wilderness areas? What is the role of the individual in responding to these categories? What's the role of government? What's the role of the arts and humanities? We need to have these same conversations that Cole was having. And I think that's a good transition for our next section, because I think we need to think about what definitions of wilderness mean in today's context, as well as what they meant in the past. So we've seen how transatlantic romanticism and Thomas Cole grappled with the tensions between wilderness and civilization. For this last part, I'd like to see how these changes are reflected in the English language itself. And I'll be using here a favorite tool of English professors, the Oxford English Dictionary, which shows you not only etymology, but how words change over time, which is a really exciting way to look at language. I picked these out because I think many of these definitions of wilderness have negative connotations, and they might be a little surprising considering what we've felt and discussed during this conference about all the positive things about wilderness. But what I would argue is that some of these negative connotations are not entirely gone. They're not obliterated. They're still hanging on in some way. Particularly this first one, the idea of a wild or uncultivated land distinguished from desert, which can't be cultivated. So that suggests that wilderness could be cultivated, but is not being cultivated for whatever reason. So I think that's interesting. There's an idea that being uncultivated is a choice. The second definition, a waste or desolate region of any kind, this is also still around today. The idea that you're somehow wasting a resource if it's preserved, that it's an either or. You're either wasting it or using it. This third one, something figured as a region of a wild or desolate character or in which one wanders or loses one's way. So this is really quite an interesting definition, and it shares the root with bewilder. If you get bewildered, you get turned around, you get confused. So this has a more emotional and even religious context here, and I think that especially paired up with the last two, in which you could be desolate or lost, or you could get confused in a vast assemblage of things or living plants. All three of these suggest that wilderness is somehow dangerous, right? That it's somehow perilous, okay? So we could say that these meanings are dead and gone, and yet I think in certain local contexts, they're still very much alive. Where I live now in Idaho, and I think the same is true here in Montana, a significant portion of people who live here can trace their family's heritage to pioneers or to native peoples who were displaced by the Homestead Act. And so some of these ideas of wilderness, particularly the negative ideas, are still operative. They're still embedded. Maybe not at the conscious level, but they're still embedded. And I think all we have to do is look at one hot-button topic, like wolves, to see a lot of these older, more negative associations come flooding forward. And yet they're not always discussed in that context. So on one hand, I've picked these somewhat negative, negative not necessarily, you could see how some of these negatives turn to be positive, but I'm going to intentionally contrast it with the definition of wilderness in the Wilderness Act. And I'm doing this for two reasons. One is to contrast them with what we just talked about, but also to see how many of the ideas in this tract here come from transatlantic romanticism, particularly this last part here in which we have the idea of ecological, geological, or other features of scientific, educational, scenic, or historical value. So here's an attempt to come up with new ideas of value, not values based on commodities, values based on other ideas of nature. Okay? And the Romantics are very important in that shift, and it was a very major paradigm shift. It's a shift that we could learn from, that we can be inspired from, but also it suggests how powerful language can be in forging new perspectives. The second reason I highlighted language in here is that some of these terms, I think, need to be reevaluated and renegotiated. I'm thinking about untrammeled, undeveloped, unimpaired. I think that as climate change becomes a reality, we have to address that these are not really correct adjectives anymore. And whether it's dust from China or beetles or fire or mercury or climate change itself, that in some sense these wilderness areas are already trammeled or already impaired, and that we need to address that in our language. If we want wilderness areas to look exactly as they did when they were founded, that might involve management. I'm not saying I advocate that, but I think if we choose not to manage it, we must be prepared for what it might look like, and that it might look very differently than it did when these areas were founded, particularly given the fact that you can't work wilderness lands with mechanized means, right? So that's a choice, and if it's a choice we're going to make, we need to know what we're doing, and then we need to make that choice consciously and with our eyes open. So in conclusion, I want to end where I started, and I'll put a nice picture up there for you to look at, which is with a question. When I asked that question, what I can do as a humanist, I do believe that the humanists can do a lot, and we need to be at the table as we discuss the questions of what we're going to do in the future. And so not only can we add the perspective of intellectual history to see where we've come and why we've come here and how we got here. And also to understand the deeply embedded cultural values that don't just go away because times change. And they need to be addressed, and they need to be brought to the table as part of the conversation. But there's a third and final point, which is that we need to forge new language in order to articulate the situation we are in now. And this is urgent because our environmental situation is changing rapidly. You could say just as rapidly as in the Romantic period, possibly even more so in the near future. One of the exciting things about the Romantic period is there was a sense of empowerment and idealism that artists and writers and intellectuals could change the world through art and poetry and through ideas. And I think particularly of how many words the Romantics either renewed or coined: the imagination, the sublime, terrific, awesome. Some of these words have lost their edge now and have become commonplace. But at their time, they were electric with life. They were vibrant, they were edgy, they were fresh. They invited people to look about nature in new ways. Nature as healing, restorative, instructive, a place of powerful spiritual and personal discovery. These ideas were not always in place. The Romantics helped these ideas be born through language, through experimentations in language. So I feel we need to establish some new language to define where we are now. Last year, Jed Purdy is a professor of law at Duke, and he came to my university to talk about the Anthropocene, and I know that's come up several times at the conference. It's a very heavy topic, and it could have been a very depressing talk, but surprisingly, it was very inspiring. Professor Purdy pointed out that if we admit that we are truly in the Anthropocene, then we are directly shaping the natural world, and we need to be aware but also empowered about how and what nature we're shaping and why we're doing it and what we want it to look like. We must use our imaginations, both individual and collective, to imagine what kind of world we want to live in. I'm really grateful for this conference because I already had new ideas. When Chris Peterson talked about intrinsic natural value language and relative wild and cultural wildscapes, this is already happening. The new language is starting to be formed. And I also appreciated Donald Worster's comment that there can be a pragmatic balance between economic individualism and redistribution and as well higher altruism, and that Cole, in a way, saw this 175 years ago. And I think that we can learn, not only from him, but from the Romantics on both sides of the Atlantic. We can use their experiments, experiences, and inspiration to forge our own visions of nature and also of wilderness. And I think by doing this, we would honor the legacy and intentions of the Wilderness Act of 1964. Thank you so much.
I also want to thank Dane, Jim, Rob, Mickey, and all the other people behind the scenes, my fellow speakers, and you guys for coming. Thank you. This has been an amazing experience so far. They saw in the water many of the serpent kind, wondrous sea dragons exploring the waters, such Nicars as lie on the headlands, who, in the mornings, often accomplish sorrowful deeds on the sail road, serpents and wild beasts. This is the end of Beowulf, the great epic poem. Here, Beowulf has slain Grendel's mother, and he's melting into the flaming seas, another region, a place beyond human influence. Wild beasts, the Old English, for which the Old English word is wildur, is one of the earliest recorded uses for our word wilderness in the English language. This means that the text of English literature, Beowulf, gives us our word for wilderness. Roderick Nash, I know this isn't Holmes' favorite person, but Roderick Nash in Wilderness in the American Mind traces the concept through policy, politicians, and presidents. But one of his main sources is literature. By literature, I mean that texts that have been crafted for the purpose of giving us a heightened experience. Nash pauses on Nathaniel Hawthorne's 1839 Scarlet Letter, which casts wilderness as a place of lawlessness, filled with Indians and danger. The forest is a moral wilderness, where Hester Prynne wanders to find freedom from ostracism, but it's also a place of evil and sin. But it's not just Hawthorne and Beowulf that use the word, as Sam has already shown us with Thomas Cole, but there's Montaigne, Rousseau, Burke, Thoreau, Emerson, Muir, Robert Service, and Gary Snyder. These are just a sliver of the writers who fold the word and the concept wilderness into their literary work. For his part, Gary Snyder turns to Shakespeare as he grapples with wilderness in his book, The Practice of the Wild. The word wilderness, earlier wilderness, Old English wilderness, he says, is a space of sea or air, as in Shakespeare, I stand as upon a rock environed with a wilderness of sea. That's from Titus Andronicus. He also turns to John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress and says, I walked through the wilderness of the world, to make his point that wilderness is a place of difficulty and danger. And finally, he turns to John Milton. Milton says, uses the term a wilderness of sweets. And Snyder interprets that Milton's usage of wilderness catches the very real condition of energy and richness that's so often found in wild systems. Well, what does this mean? I can't actually see what my next slides are, sorry. So what does this mean? It means that wilderness is as much a literary thing as a policy thing, as much an imaginative word as a practical one, as much art as it is land. For the past 10 years, I've been studying the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, and there's a little display back there that shows some photos of the Montana side of that wilderness. With my collaborator, Dennis Baird from the University of Idaho, and a NEH grant, we've attempted to preserve the documentary history of this one wilderness, just as people have worked to preserve the land over the last century. We've collected every piece of paper we could find from individuals and remote Forest Service station outposts to the National Archives and Records Office in Maryland and the Library of Congress in DC, and conducted over 50 oral histories. One of our oral histories was with Rob Mason, who used to be the executive director of the Selway Bitterroot Foundation, and he now works for the Wilderness Society in Boise. And he said in his interview, if you look at the whole national wilderness preservation system, the Selway wouldn't be one of the places that you would say, wow, that's one of the most spectacularly beautiful places that there is. It is beautiful, there's no question, but it's not the Sierras. It's not a slot canyon in southern Utah with sunlight filtering down through the red rocks. But the thing that makes the Selway special is that it's super wild. I mean, it's the epitome of wilderness. It's so big, there's so few inhabitants. Contrast it to a place like Death Valley, which has roads cutting into it, and it's so rugged, it makes it hard to get around. And there's a tremendous solitude and fear. There's risk when you're out there by yourself. So all that collectively makes it wild. I want to suggest that the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness was one of the inspirations for the Wilderness Act by giving you a little bit of cultural and literary history about it. The way I see it, the Selway Bitterroot inspired people to protect it because it was already protecting itself in some ways. Unlike other large natural landscapes that came under consideration for Forest Service wilderness and primitive designations in the 1920s and 30s, the Selway Bitterroot has a unique body. It's undergirded by a geological formation called the Idaho batholith, which is barren of minerals, so it doesn't attract much mining, and doesn't make for very good soil for farming and ranching. That's why in 1925, a forester named Franklin Reed, in response to Aldo Leopold, could say, the Bitterroot backcountry covers about 1 million acres in which exists or is planned no road. In the Bitterroot area, there are practically no economic resources, which will demand utilization for many years. The mountain range here is some of the roughest and rockiest in America. There are practically no recreation resources except scenery. Well, maybe so, but that doesn't mean that people didn't want to build roads through it. Guy Brandborg, who was supervisor of the Bitterroot National Forest from 1935 to 1955, came under continual pressure by people who wanted to punch roads through the mountains and down the rivers for fire protection. I'm just going to go through a few of the slides to show you how the scenery. If Brandberg was passionate about protecting the Selway Bitterroot, Bob Marshall was a maniac. You just have to read some of his letters that he wrote while he was traveling through the Selway Bitterroot in the mid-1920s. One of my favorite is when he was on his 1926 winter trip over Lolo Pass, and he saw himself standing on the edge of the known world. He was this great gulf between the world and himself because he was so far deep in the wilderness. In 1935, Marshall, Leopold, and a few others founded the Wilderness Society, as many people have said here in the conference so far. The following year, Marshall used his sway with the Forest Service leadership to establish the Selway Bitterroot primitive area at 1,875,000 acres. It was the largest in the country at the time. It was actually, I don't know if you know this, it was supposed to be called the Bob Marshall Wilderness. There was petitions in the Forest Service, and it went all the way up to the East Coast, D.C., and someone put a kibosh and said it wasn't beautiful enough to bear Bob Marshall's name after he died. So you guys got it instead in Montana. The next year, 1937, Marshall took one of his lengthy walks through the Bitterroot. On his way out, he visited the Brandbergs in Hamilton to talk about the wilderness idea. Brandberg's son Stuart was just 12, but he remembered the visit clearly. He remembered Bob Marshall's face was red from being sunburned because he didn't, cover himself when he was walking. Whether they mentioned the Wilderness Society or not, we don't know. But it was one of those wonderfully serendipitous moments in history, because less than 20 years later, in 1954, Stuart became secretary of the Wilderness Society, and he became Howard Zonheiser's right-hand man, helping to shepherd the bill through the politics and the public. As we know, Zonheiser passed just a few months before the signing of the act, so Stuart, a Selway Bitterroot boy, was there in his place. Of course, the Selway Bitterroot was among the first, it was part of the first lands protected by the Act. There he is with Johnson. I actually took this from the Missoulian just last week, so thank you to whoever found that slide. The Selway Bitterroot is very much an American story, but it has its own peculiarities. Historically, the Salish and the Nimiipuu used the Bitterroot, but within what's now the wilderness boundary, the oldest Indian village is called Nihatpaloo. We know this because in 1891, a Nimiipuu elder by the name of Billy drew a map for a government ethnographer, and he identified dozens and dozens of Nez Perce villages within the Selway and the Clearwater drainages. Some of these groups were called the Selwapuu, people of the Selway, and Nihatlapuu was one of those villages deep in what's now the Selway Bitterroot, part of the Selwapuu people. That village has been studied by archaeologists with assistance from the tribes more than any other archaeological site that I personally know of. And they believe that it is the oldest human site in the wilderness area. They think that the people who lived in Nahatlapu had a very high standard of living. They lived a very cushy life with lots of food and not many enemies and beautiful, sandy beaches and water, salmon. But they lost their power and prestige at the beginning of the 19th century, and they abandoned their camp. It was about this time that explorers, missionaries, trappers, and scientists started trickling into the Selway Bitterroot. I say trickle because the land was rugged. When Lewis and Clark and their expedition came through in 1805, they recorded almost 200 words of grumbling and complaint about the landscape. I've actually physically counted them. More than any other place that they traveled. They really weren't complainers, but when they came to the Selway Bitterroot, they just were whining all the time. After them, John Work, the engineer, came in 1831, Father De Smet in 1841, the missionary Wellington Bird and Sewell Trow in 1866. They built the wagon road over Lolo Pass, and then that same road was used by Chief Joseph and the non-treaty Nez Perce in 1877 as they were fleeing the U.S. government running from General Howard. The homesteaders and trappers and miners came in the 1880s. One of the first homesteads was this one, taken up by the Schisler brothers, who were outlaws. You can see the skull and crossbones under the gable. One of the brothers had killed a man in Stites, Idaho, so they were running from the law. Ironically, or maybe fittingly, this cabin, when they abandoned it, became the first Forest Service station back there in 1905, which I think is just a wonderful metaphor for how the outlaws and the Forest Service men were cut kind of from the same cloth. Homestead families were poor, outfitters, farmers, rangers. Most of them did end up working for the Forest Service seasonally. Here they are clearing the airfield at Moose Creek. They were strangely diverse. That is what I found. Early on, there was a single mother and her daughter who took up a homestead. There was a Native American homesteader, an African American fire cook, and a number of bachelors who lived together. There was one couple of bachelors who were referred to as the two ponies because they were never seen apart. There was a blind man named Tom Running, which Gifford Pinchot wrote about very tenderly and compassionately when he toured the area in 1896. But the Selway had a number of people throughout its human history who wanted to see it protected. In the 1930s, a major grazing operation was ended when a landowner just turned over his homestead to the Forest Service because he didn't want to see it developed. He wanted it to be protected and go back to its natural state. The area is the birthplace of prescribed natural fire because of the fire study programs of trapper turned fire chief Bud Moore. This is actually, that's actually Bud Moore with his dog. The Selway River is one of the most intact U.S. watersheds because, for a number of reasons, but one is because in 1970 a group of foresters got together and passed a law or a rule that there was only one whitewater launch per day on the Selway River of 12 people or less. It's the most difficult river to get a permit on in the U.S., but it also makes the river more less polluted and fewer people. Trails have been maintained by people like Connie Saylor, who for 20 years enlisted Iowa farm kids from a state where there is no wilderness to do trail maintenance. Many of those people later went into careers in wilderness conservation. Saylor also has the distinction of scolding Harrison Ford for flying his Beaver aircraft into the Selway Bitterroot. And the Selway Bitterroot Foundation, under people like Rob Mason, has established an extensive wilderness intern program for college students that's growing every year, where students learn how to be wilderness stewards. This was taken by one of the interns. So now I want to go back to where I started, which is another famous trick of English professors. Arches has its Ed Abbey, Yosemite it's John Muir, Alaska it's Jack London. If I'm suggesting that the Selway Bitterroot played and continues to play a role in the evolving idea of wilderness, and that the wild is a literary concept, at least to some extent, where do we find its literature, and what meanings emerge from that literature? In 1919, Norman Maclean worked for the Forest Service on Grave Peak. His short story, "In a River Runs Through It," The Ranger, the Cook, and the Hole in the Sky, is based on that experience. It was published in 1976, but it refers to Marshall's own experience, even though it's fiction, in 1919. The story focuses on a mule packer, Bill Bell, and the narrator's admiration for him as the narrator makes all these bumbles and mistakes in the backcountry. In the story, early on and then throughout, Maclean says, Bill Bell was a major artist. And here's his description of Bell unpacking a mule. One wet satin back after another without saddle or saddle sore, and not a spot of white wet flesh where hair and hide had rubbed off. Perhaps one has to know something about keeping packs balanced on the backs of animals to think this beautiful or to notice it at all, but to all those who work come moments of beauty unseen by the rest of the world. So Maclean builds his own art around the art of the mule packer. He was a major Shakespeare professor in the United States, and so he knew what he was doing by elevating the work of the packer to art. Maclean's an example of using the content of wilderness, but we know to create art, but we know that any content can be literary if it has the right artists. I'm going to turn now to another kind of artist and talk about a few examples where writers merge form and content. This artist, her name's Sarah Sweat. She lives in Moscow, Idaho, where I live, and she has just finished a few years ago a series of literary works called slow literature, by weaving her stories of wilderness into tapestries. Sarah was a student at Harvard in the early 80s, and after just 1 year at Harvard, she said, I got to get out of here. So she came to the Selway Bitterroot, where she worked for an outfitter. There she made her own spindle and her own thread from the hair of animals back there. She eventually married a mule packer, and she wrote stories, which she has just now, much later, woven into this series of tapestries. They take years to weave, and of course she has to do everything backwards. They sell for about $10,000 to $20,000 a piece. But what's so cool about them is that they're artistic transformations of the landscape. They take the actual material of the place, the wood, the wool, the hair of animals, and spin them into a tale. Can you guys see this? Oh, too bad. So she is, she's writing, she's replicating, this is a huge tapestry, by the way. Yeah, it's about this size in real life. She wrote these things when she lived back there in the Selway Bitterroot. She wrote them on the scraps of paper and receipts and stuff. And so I will just read a little bit of this one. It's called The Sketchbook. The sketchbook was the sketchbook was new. Its pages thick and blank. The yarn was asparagus green, braised asparagus. Oh God, I can't even see this. She mused. As she tucked the skein behind the book with a glimmer of parsley lovely. Not so the ink. In the squat glass jar she packed next. Wow, I can't even see this. She packed next. It had the hue and character of horse piss, but she gave it a swish just the same and nestled it into the saddlebag next to the strands of wool. Piss or asparagus, it was the ink she had made, and the only ink for more miles than she cared to contemplate. So she was damned if she put it at risk. Running off with the mule was reckless enough. The mule was gorgeous and also unhinged. I'll just stop there. So Sarah Sweat is actually using, this is a different kind of mule packing than Maclean's Bill Bell. She's in transforming the materials of the space into a tapestry, into a story, weaving a story and weaving a tapestry. What I think's interesting is she also weaves her mistakes in there, her mistakes and corrections. Because if you read further in her stories, she does take responsibility for some of the mistakes she made when this relationship with this mule packer. Here's another example. So the transformation of the landscape is akin to what poets of the 1960s were trying to do with their verse, I think. And some of them were in the Bitterroots, Edward Dorn and Gary Snyder in particular. Gary Snyder had a camp up in the Bitterroot, and Allen Ginsberg came and stayed there, I guess. I have never seen it, but I would love to. Dorn and Snyder and Ginsberg and all of these beat poets of the 60s were influenced by this poet named Charles Olson, who developed an idea called projective verse. And by that he meant poetry that takes the shape of the land. Some of Olson's phrases were, "Your job as a poet is to find connections between things. Live nature's force." He talked about the field of the poem and the ground of the poem. He says, art does not seek to describe, but to enact. And this is one of Snyder's poems about this area. And you can see how the poetry kind of runs, it's about wind and fire and a creek, and it sort of moves almost like a creek. I'm not going to read the whole thing. And there's no narrative here. It's grabbing things from the landscape as he's sitting there absorbing it. Here, far light on the Bitterroots, scramble down, willow slide, changing clouds above, shapes on glowing sun, ball, writing, choosing, reaching out against eternal azure, us resting on dry fern and watching. So that, to me, is very similar to what Sarah Sweat is doing with her weaving, is taking the material of the place and working it into literature. My last example comes from a woman named Elizabeth Wilson, who worked, she was a Nez Perce tribal elder. She was interviewed when she was 91 in the 1970s, and she was actually a relative of Chief Joseph. The last time she had met him was in 1904. She was actually interviewed by a professor of music at Washington State University. And I'm just going to play you two short clips from her oral history. So, let's see.
we're going to do a Wayakin song. That's a guiding spirit song that one man used to sing. Yeah. The song is from the mountain goat song. The man got in contact with him, got the song from him and the power along with it. And I'll sing a song. Now that's that. It's a goat that's all by itself, king goat that lives. Now the word in that chant it says, I wander along only in the higher mountains and the heads of the streams all the way through. I'm never down anywhere where it's civilized country. I'm way up in the wilderness. Wawama wiya ahal wiya nahi. Wawama means way up back in the... And that's the goat song, Kosalat.
Okay. And then one more. This is, by the way, Wilson and her family did live in the Selway Bitterroot, so, but this refers to more the Snake River. It's her son Angus, and she are talking about the wind blowing through dead snags.
In the valley now, you get that effect of whitebird, not whitebird, but I suppose you could on a salmon river. But up the Snake River, the wind blows in such a way up that the colors get tim.
Yeah.
It sounds like, at times it'll sound like there's a band of sheep at a distance where they're all, say maybe a herd of them, maybe 50 or 100 would be all just baying at once. And that, as a matter of fact, and it's just the wind. It's the way the wind whistles down through. Of course, the wind goes an awful lot on the Snake River there around Buffalo Eddy and down the river or up the river. And it's just the sound of it. It's a kind of a weird sound. Not real.
And these snags, tell them about Tiyapo.
Well, that's a right. I explained to Tiyapo what that is. It's merely the wind going through dead snags. You
Just like whistling, I used to hear it. No.
You only hear it in the mountains, where fire has swept through, and even one snag will make a noise. But where there's a bunch of them, you just hear.
Yeah. Sad noise, I've heard that. What you tell me you heard
it? It hits all notes, my gosh.
Yeah.
So in conclusion, I want to suggest that maybe people like Sarah Sweat, the beat poets, Gary Snyder, Edward Dorn, who came here, and maybe even Norman MacLean, they were actually doing what Native peoples had been doing artistically for many years, thousands of years, which is listening to the land and hearing the land, because the land speaks. The land has a song, that the goat has a song, and the wind through the snag actually has a sound that has meaning. It's a sad noise. And the land itself creates a literary text that has meaning. So, thank you.
Well, thank you, Samantha and Debbie. That was fabulous stuff. And I think we have time for a few questions. Who'd like to please come up to the microphone if you have a question, and let's have a chat. Don't all rush up at once. Well, I have a question for Debbie. I understand you have a little family history in the area. Tell us about that.
I do, yeah. Well, I became interested in the Selway because when I was a British romanticist living in London. My grandmother died, and she had never spoken about my grandfather, who I guess she just did not like at all. And I didn't know him because he died when I was born, but he had been a ranger back here in the Selway Bitterroot for 12 years, from 1929 through 42. Before that, he homesteaded right across the river. In fact, some of those photos I showed you were of him. He'd homesteaded right across from the Outlaw Hangout Forest Service station. And I left London and became obsessed with finding out who he was and what this place was. I'd actually never stepped foot in a wilderness area before, so my story is a bit of a conversion story. So, yeah.
It's great, thanks.
Samantha, my colleague Amy Robinson and I were intrigued by your suggestion that perhaps we need to revisit some words that have lost some of their meaning over time. I've thought a lot about the word awesome in particular lately, because I've had some very awesome experiences that have, struck a combination of fear and joy into myself. But using the word awesome as much as I do, just in common conversation, the meaning is lost. And I guess maybe I'm going to put the question back to you, because we immediately started thinking to ourselves, God, what are those new words that we might come up with? How does one do that? And then how do you get society to start using them? What words could we maybe start using going forward to try to electrify these landscapes once more in the imagination of the public?
Great, thank you. Well, that's a great question. And I think that it happens with language that over time it does change, of course. I mean, awesome is one of my favorites because all my students use it, I use it, overuse it, and it means nothing anymore, right? The original intent was something that was so awe-inspiring, or also awful, came from that same root, that you were actually negatively impacted by that. You were overwhelmed, you were almost afraid. So I think that, of course, very powerful words might lose their edge more quickly. But one of the reasons I'm so happy to come to this conference is to hear, for example, from Chris's talk, some of the people are working with new language. So, I mean, I think the idea of rewilding is interesting, that wilderness, the idea, as soon as we suggest that wilderness, first of all, is pristine and it's also static in some sense, and what happens when that's degraded? Do we give up? Do we just say, oh, there's no more wilderness, or do we rewild? Or do we say, here are wilderness areas that are relatively wild, and that's worth something, and let's protect that. So I think that it needs, I think about what we can do today. So I think about the energy of young generations today need to think about language and find the language that works. And it could even be from science fiction. Maybe the cyborg is going to be the new word, right? That people think, oh my God, where's the boundary between the physical body that we were given at birth and what we might do to it, right? So I don't even know if we can predict what the new words are, but I think we need to actively look for them. And I think that historically, if we look into the history of our language, we might even be able to find existing words that come back to life. I think the word creature, for example, is a word that is a very old word. But then when Mary Shelley's Frankenstein used creature, it took on a very different connotation. So even it can be old words that we study and look at again. But I'm very much interested in the new language. One of the reasons I like going to interdisciplinary conferences, I like to hear what other fields are doing with their language, whether it's the Anthropocene, which is a geological term, whether it's something like, I think it's ecology services, this idea that intact environments provide services to the watershed. I mean, to me, that's so alien to my training in English literature, but it makes total sense. And if that's something that can be used at a board meeting or at a public hearing to say these are services that are actually millions of dollars worth of services that the forests are providing for free if we let them provide it. So I think also reaching across disciplines is extremely important, and not staying in the silo and just saying, here's only my language. Well, how are other fields envisioning new relationships or revisiting old relationships? So I'm sure you have some words you'd like to share that you might be thinking about. I think we all do, and we should be talking to each other about it.
Let me offer a further reflection on that. Debbie's recordings put me in mind of the fact that there are people who've lived here from time immemorial, the Native American people, and they have words for everything. One of the most exciting things that's happening in Indian country here in Montana, I'm sure also in Idaho, is the reclamation of indigenous languages. The Native people themselves are creating schools and dictionaries and ways of expressing their own thoughts in their own language. And that is going to be a wonderful word hoard, not only for Native peoples, but for everybody who lives and works in this region, especially in those untrammeled spaces that we call wilderness. One of my favorite expressions for the Rocky Mountains in this part of the world is the backbone of the world. That's what the Blackfeet people call the Rocky Mountains in the Glacier Park area. And one of the best ways to see Glacier Park, by the way, is on the Sun Tours, which is run by the Blackfeet people. And you get an alternative perspective on everything about the park. We've seen in big wilderness areas, in several cases, there have been important replacements of the names of mountains, for example, so that Mount Whitney in Alaska is now known to everybody simply as Denali. We could use some more of that, because that is some of the most authentic language that exists to describe these places.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, I don't know much about Native languages except for the Nimipu, which I've studied their syllabary. And the cool thing about that is, I don't know the percentage, but a lot of their words have to do with interacting with the natural world. And they're words for things that we don't have. Like they have a single word for slapping a mosquito that's filled with blood on your arm. And so it's so cool that part of our connection, reconnecting with a wild place could be recovering language that has, that has terms for things that happen when you interact with the wild landscape.
There's an article in the current Orion magazine where a wilderness advocate is taking to task someone from the recreation industry for using the word infrastructure to describe wilderness.
Yeah.
What happens when you use the wrong word?
Yeah. Is that for all of us, I think? Is that for all of us? Well, I think the idea of right words and wrong words is less useful than thinking more pragmatically. Again, thanks to Donald Worster's talk. I mean, thinking pragmatically, language is limited. Language has certainly cultural embedded values in it. But if we use the language and we're aware of those embedded values and we discuss those embedded values, then we can take away what doesn't work. So someone asked me the other day about sustainability. How do you feel about the word sustainability? And I said, well, to be totally honest with you, I know it stands for a lot of good initiatives, but it does frame certain things in a way that I want to ask more questions. Well, like, what kind of sustainability? Does this mean 10 generations? Does this mean that it's going to be a greenwash of a company's activities? What is the sustainability? So I think that the language should be at the forefront, which is why I love to go to the OED to start the conversation. Well, let's look at how language has evolved and all of the multiple reasons and that it evolved the way it did. The wrong word is tough. I think personally there needs to be a lot more dialogue across every boundary that there is. Class boundaries, regional boundaries, between business and science, between science and the humanities. I'm in favor for breaking down the boundaries because if we don't, we're just going to lose what we've already got. And I think there's just too many competing interests to narrow and specialize a way that we need to find language that works. So if infrastructure is the wrong word, then let's start. Why is it the wrong word? Let's get the conversation going. Because at some point there needs to be some convergence. I love the 19th century because there were things like natural history, or natural philosophy, like things that don't exist. They were inherently interdisciplinary, and if you were someone like Thoreau, you could do some science, you could read poetry, You could go on long walks. You could chat with Emerson. You could have a very broad set of conversations. And I think we've lost that because we've become so specialized. So I think if the specialized word has something unique to add, I'm not sure how infrastructure would, but I would ask the person, well, tell me. I think ecology services has something to add. If there's a situation in which we're coming down to nickel and diming, whether we should preserve a particular place, we're like, well, how about this? We have to add this into the value of the logs that might come out. We have to add the ecology services in. So you can also be empowered to use language that's way outside your field to help the process of communicating. I think in Idaho, there's a lot of common ground for people who love the land. They might use the land differently, they might have different ideas of nature, but I don't feel like we're making the most of our love of the land. And to do that, we have to be somewhat patient with each other and open up spaces where we can have those conversations, even if they're sometimes risky. But I want to find out more about the infrastructure, because that seems, I'm already intrigued.
Well, that's the new Orion
the new one.
thing.
Okay,
yeah.
so tell me, Debbie.
Well, I just know that that's their focus
That's the
now
new
is
thing.
infrastructure. But I think using the wrong word is great. Like, do it more often. That's what poets do. They're constantly putting a word where it's not supposed to, and that's the kind of heightened effect that you get from language. Language is organic, just like the wilderness, just like a wild natural area. So it's great that people want to argue about it because it means they care, but I like do it more often. It makes language more, creates more frisson. It's more exciting.
I think that's it for our time, but please join me in thanking both of our speakers.